Robert Graves, I, Claudius. Chapter 16. Germanicus was met at Bonn by the deputation of senators sent by Tiberius. They really came to see whether Germanicus had been either exaggerating or minimizing the seriousness of the mutiny. They also brought a private letter from Tiberius approving the promises made to the men on his behalf, with the exception of the doubled bequest, which would now have to be promised to the entire army, not merely the regiments in Germany. Tiberius congratulated Germanicus on the apparent success of the ruse, but deplored the necessity of forgery. He added that whether he fulfilled the promises depended on the behavior of the men. By this he did not mean, as Germanicus supposed, that if the men returned to obedience he would fulfill the promises, but exactly the reverse. Germanicus wrote back at once apologizing for the expense involved in the doubling of the bequest, but explained that the money was being paid from his own purse, and the men would not know that it was not Tiberius who was their benefactor, and that in the forged letter he had made it plain that only the German regiments were to benefit, making the payment a reward for their recent successful campaign across the Rhine. As for the other specific promises, the veterans of 20 years' service had already been discharged and were only remaining with the colors until the bounty money arrived for them. Germanicus could ill afford this heavy charge on his estate, and wrote asking me not to press him for repayment of my 50,000 for a while. I answered that it had not been a loan but a gift, which I was proud to have been able to make. But to return to the order of events. 2 of the regiments were in their winter quarters at Bonn when the deputation arrived. Their march back, under their general, had been a disgraceful display. The bugs, which had contained the money, were tied to long poles and carried mouthwards between the standards. The other 2 regiments had refused to leave the summer camp until the whole bequest was paid them. The Bonn regiments, the 1st and 20th, suspected that the deputation had been sent to cancel the concessions, and began to riot again. Some of them were for marching to their new kingdom at once, and at midday a party broke into Germanicus's quarters, where the eagle of the 20th Regiment was kept in a locked shrine, and pulled him out of bed, tore the key of the shrine from the thin gold chain which he wore round his neck, unlocked the shrine, and seized the eagle. As they marched, shouting down the streets, calling on their comrades to follow the eagle, they met the senators of the deputation, who had heard the noise and came running for protection to Germanicus. The soldiers cursed and drew their swords. The senators changed their direction and darted into the headquarters of the 1st Regiment, where they took sanctuary with its eagle. But their pursuers were mad with rage and drink, and if the eagle-bearer had not been a man of courage, and a good swordsman too, the leader of the deputation would have had his skull split open, a crime which would have outlawed the regiment beyond pardon, and been the signal for civil war throughout the country. The disorders continued all night, but fortunately without bloodshed, except as the result of drunken brawls between rival companies of soldiers. When dawn came, Germanicus told the trumpeter to blow the assembly, and stepped on the tribunal, putting the leader of the senatorial deputation beside him. The men were in a nervous, guilty, irritable mood, but Germanicus's courage fascinated them. He stood up, commanded silence, and then gave a great yawn. He covered his mouth with his hand and apologized, saying that he had not slept well because of the scuffling mice in his quarters. The men liked that joke and laughed. He did not laugh with them. Heaven be praised that dawn is here. Never have I known such an evil night. At one moment I dreamed that the eagle of the 20th flew away. What a delight to see it on parade this morning. There were destructive spirits hovering in the camp, sent beyond doubt by some god whom we have offended. You all felt the madness, and it was only by a miracle that you were prevented from committing a crime unparalleled in the history of Rome. The unprovoked murder of an ambassador of your own city, who had taken sanctuary from your swords with your own regimental deities. He then explained that the deputation had come merely to confirm Tiberius's original promises on behalf of the Senate and to report whether they were being faithfully executed by himself. Well, what about it then? Where's the rest of the bounty? Someone shouted. And the cry was taken up. We want our bounty. But by a lucky chance, the money wagons were sighted at that moment, driving into the camp under convoy of a troop of auxiliary horse. Germanicus took advantage of the situation to send the senators hurriedly back to Rome under escort of these same auxiliaries. Then he supervised the distribution of the coin, having difficulty in restraining some of the men from plundering the money intended for the other regiments. The disorder increased that afternoon. So much gold in the men's purses meant heavy drinking and reckless gambling. Germanicus decided that it was not safe for Agrippina, who was now with him, to remain in the camp. She was pregnant again, and though her young sons, my nephews Nero and Drusus, were here at Rome, staying with my mother and myself, she had little Gaius there with her. This pretty child had become the army mascot, and someone had made him a miniature soldier suit, complete with tin breastplate and sword and helmet and shield. Everyone spoilt him. When his mother put on his ordinary clothes and sandals, he used to cry and plead for his sword and his little boots to go visiting the tents. So he was nicknamed Caligula, or Little Boot. Germanicus insisted on Agrippina's going away, though she swore that she was afraid of nothing, and the world nothing would far rather die with him there than have news from safety of his murder by the mutineers. Germanicus insisted on Agrippina's going away, though she swore that she was afraid of nothing and would far rather die with him there than have news from safety of his murder by the mutineers. But he asked her whether she thought that Livia would make a good mother for their orphan children, and this decided her to do as he wished. With her went several officers' wives with their children, all weeping and wearing mourning clothes. They passed on foot, slowly through the camp, without their usual attendants, like fugitives from a doomed city. A single rough cart, drawn by a mule, was all their transport. Cassius Chaerea went with them as guide and sole protector. Caligula rode on Cassius's back, as if on a charger, shouting and making the regulation sword cuts and parries in the air with his sword, as the cavalry men had taught him. They left the camp very early in the morning, and hardly anyone saw them go, for there was no guard at the gate, and nobody now took the trouble to blow the reveille. Most of the men sleeping like pigs till 10 or 11 o'clock. A few old soldiers, who woke early from long habit, were outside the camp gathering firewood for their breakfast, and called to ask where the ladies were off to. "To Treves," shouted Cassius. "The commander-in-chief is setting his wife and child away to the protection of the uncivilized but loyal French allies of Treves, rather than risk their murder by the famous First Regiment. Tell your comrades that." The old soldiers hurried back to the camp, and one of them, the old man, Pomponius, got hold of a trumpet and blew the alarm. The men came tumbling out of their tents, half asleep, with their swords in their hands. "What's wrong? What's happened?" "He's been sent away from us. That's the end of our luck, and we'll never see him again." "Who's that? Who's been sent away?" "Our boy has. Little Boot. His father says he can't trust the First Regiment with him, so he's sent him away to the damned French allies. God knows what will happen to him there. You know what the French are. His mother has been sent off too. 7 months gone with her latest, and walking on foot, like a slave woman, poor lady. Oh, lads, Germanicus's wife, and the daughter of old Agrippa, whom we used to call the soldier's friend, and our little Boot." Soldiers really are an extraordinary race of men, as shield leather, as superstitious as Egyptians, and as sentimental as Sabine grandmothers. 10 minutes later, there were about 2,000 men besieging Germanicus's tent in a drunken ecstasy of sorrow and repentance, and imploring him to let his lady come back with their darling little boy. Germanicus came out to them with a pale, angry face, and told them to trouble him no more. They had disgraced themselves and him and the name of Rome, and he could never trust them so long as he lived. They had done him no kindness in wresting his sword from him when he was on the point of plunging it into his breast. "Tell us what to do, General. We'll do anything you say. We'll swear. We'll never mutiny again. Forgive us. We'll follow you to the world's end. But give us back our little playfellow." Germanicus said, "These are my conditions. Swear allegiance to my father Tiberius, and sort out from among yourselves the men responsible for the death of your captains. the insult to the deputation, and stealing of the eagle. If you do this, you will so far have my forgiveness that I shall let you have your playfellow back. My wife, however, must not be brought to bed in this camp until it has been purged of guilt. Her time is near now, and I want no evil influence to cloud the life of the child. But I can send her to Cologne instead of Treves, if you do not wish it, said that I confided her to the protection of barbarians. My full pardon will only be given when you have wiped out the memory of your bloody crimes by a bloodier victory over your country's enemies, the Germans. They swore to abide by his conditions. So he sent a messenger to overtake Agrippina and Cassius. He was to explain matters and fetch Caligula back. The men ran to the tents and called on every loyal comrade to join them and arrest the ringleaders of the mutiny. About 100 men were seized and frog-marched to the tribunal, about which the remainder of the 2 regiments formed a hollow square with drawn swords. A colonel made each prisoner in turn mount a rough scaffold, which had been put up beside the tribunal, and if the men of his company judged him guilty, he was thrown down and beheaded by them. Germanicus said nothing throughout the 2 hours of this informal trial, sitting with folded arms and an impassive face. All but a few of the prisoners were found guilty. When the last head had fallen, and the bodies had been taken out of the camp to be burned, Germanicus called up every captain in turn to the tribunal, and asked him to give particulars of his service. If he had a good record, and had evidently not been appointed by favoritism, Germanicus appealed to the company veterans for their opinion of him. If they gave him a good name, and the battalion colonel had nothing against him, the man was confirmed in his rank. But if his record was bad, or if there were complaints from his company, he was degraded, and Germanicus called on the company to choose the best man they had among them to succeed him. Germanicus then thanked the men for their cooperation and called on them to take the oath of allegiance to Tiberius. They took it solemnly, and a moment later a great cheer went up. They saw Germanicus's messenger galloping back, and there was Caligula on the crupper in front of him, shouting in his shrill voice and waving his toy sword. Germanicus embraced the child and said that he had one more thing to add. 1,500 time expired veterans had been discharged from the 2 regiments in accordance with instructions from Tiberius. But if any of them, he said, wanted his full pardon, which their fellows were soon going to earn by crossing the Rhine and avenging Varus's death, they could still win it. He would permit the more active men to re-enlist in their old companies, while those who were only fit for garrison duty could enlist in a special force for service in the Tyrol, where dangerous raids from Germany had lately been reported. Would you believe it? Every man stepped forward, and more than half volunteered for active service across the Rhine. Among these active volunteers was Pomponius, who protested that he was as fit as any man in the army, in spite of his bare gums and his rupture. Germanicus made him his tent orderly, and put his grandsons into the boy guard. So everything was all right at Bonn, and Caligula was told by the men that he had put down the mutiny single-handed, and that one day he'd be a great emperor and win wonderful victories, which was very bad for the child, who was already, as I say, disgracefully spoilt. But there remained the two other regiments who were at a place called Xanten to bring to their senses. They had continued to be they had continued to be have they had continued to behave mutinously even after the payment of their bounty, and their general could do nothing with them. When news came of the change of heart in the Bonn regiments, the chief mutineers became seriously alarmed for their own safety and stirred up their comrades to fresh acts of violence and depredation. Germanicus sent their general word that he was coming down the Rhine at once at the head of a powerful force, and that if such loyal men as remained under his command did not quickly follow the example of the Bonn regiments and execute the troublemakers, he would put the whole lot to the sword indiscriminately. The general read the letter privately to the standard-bearers, non-commissioned officers, and a few trustworthy old soldiers, and told them that there was little time for delay, for Germanicus might be on them any moment. They promised him to do what they could, and letting a few more loyalists into the secret, which was well kept, they rushed into the tents at midnight on a given signal and began to massacre the mutineers. These defended themselves as best they could and killed a number of the loyalists, but they were soon overpowered. 500 men were killed or wounded that night. The rest, leaving only sentries in the camp, marched out to meet Germanicus, begging him to lead them at once across the Rhine against the enemy. Although the campaigning season was nearly at an end, the fine weather still held, and Germanicus promised to do what they asked. He threw a pontoon bridge over the river and marched across at the head of 12,000 Roman infantry, 26 battalions of allies, and 8 squadrons of cavalry. From his agents in enemy territory, he knew of a large concentration of the enemy in the villages of Munster, where an annual autumn festival in honor of the German Hercules was being held. News of the mutiny had reached the Germans. The mutineers had actually been in treaty with Hermann and had exchanged presents with him, and they were only waiting for the regiments to march away to their new kingdom in the southwest before crossing the Rhine and marching direct for Italy. Germanicus followed a rarely used forest route and surprised the Germans completely, catching them at their beer drinking. Beer is a fermented drink made from steeped grain, and they drink it to extraordinary excess at their feast. He divided his forces into 4 columns and wasted the country on a 50-mile frontage, burning the villages and slaughtering the inhabitants without respect for age or sex. On his return, he found detachments of various neighboring tribes posted to dispute his passage through the forest, but he advanced in skirmishing order and was pressing the enemy back well when there was a sudden alarm from the 20th Regiment, which was acting as rearguard, and Germanicus found that a huge force of Germans under the personal command of Hermann was upon him. Fortunately, the trees at the point were not dense, but allowed room for maneuver. Germanicus rode back to the position of most danger and cried out, "Break their line, 20th, and everything will be forgiven and forgotten." The 20th fought like madmen and threw the Germans back with huge slaughter, pursuing them far into the open country at the back of the wood. Germanicus caught sight of Hermann and challenged him to combat, but Hermann's men were running away. It would have been death for him to have accepted the challenge. He galloped off. Germanicus was as unlikely as our father had been in his pursuit of enemy chieftains. But he won his victories in the same style, and the name Germanicus, which he had inherited, he bore now in his own right. He marched the exultant army back to safety in their camps across the Rhine. Tiberius never understood Germanicus, nor Germanicus Tiberius. Tiberius, as I have said, was one of the bad Claudians. Yet he was at times easily tempted to virtue, and in a noble age might well have passed for a noble character, for he was a man of no mean capacity. But the age was not a noble one, and his heart had been hardened, and for the hardening Livia must, you will agree, bear the chief blame. Germanicus, on the other hand, was wholly inclined to virtue, and, however evil the age into which he had been born, could never have behaved any differently from the way he did. So it was that, when he refused the monarchy offered him by the German regiments, and made them swear allegiance to Tiberius, Tiberius could not make out why he should have done so. He decided that he must be even more subtle than himself, and playing some very deep game indeed. The simple explanation that Germanicus put honor above all other considerations, and that he was bound to Tiberius by military allegiance and by having been adopted as his son, never occurred to him. But Germanicus, since he did not suspect Tiberius of complicity in Livia's designs, and since Tiberius never offered him any slights or injuries, but on the contrary praised him greatly for his handling of the mutiny, and decreed him a full triumph for his campaign in Munster, believed him to be as honorably intentioned as himself, only a little simple-minded not to have been through Livia's designs yet. He determined to have a frank talk with Tiberius as soon as he went home for the triumph. But Varus's death was not yet avenged. It was 3 years before Germanicus came back. The tone of the letters exchanged between Germanicus and Tiberius during this period was set by Germanicus, who wrote with dutiful affection. Tiberius replied in the same friendly strain, because he thought that by doing so he was beating Germanicus at his own clever game. He undertook to repay him the amount of the doubled bequest, and to extend the bounty to the Balkan regiments too. As a matter of policy, he did pay the Balkan regiments this extra 3 gold pieces a man. There were threats of another mutiny, but excused himself from repaying Germanicus for a few months, on the grounds of financial embarrassment. Naturally, Germanicus did not press him for the money, and naturally, Tiberius never gave it him. Germanicus wrote again to ask me whether he might wait to repay me until Tiberius repaid him, and I wrote back that I really meant the money as a gift. Shortly after Tiberius's accession, I wrote to him and said that I had been studying law and administration, as was the case, for some time, in the hope that I would at last be given an opportunity of serving my country in some responsible capacity. He wrote back to say that it certainly was an anomaly for a man who was the brother of Germanicus and his own nephew to go about as a mere knight, and that since I was now being made a priest of Augustus, I must certainly be allowed to wear the dress of a senator, in fact, if I could undertake not to make a fool of myself in it. He should ask permission for me to adopt the brocaded gown now worn by consuls and ex-consuls. I wrote back at once to say that I would even prefer office without dress to dress without office. But his only answer to this was to send me a present of 40 golden pieces to buy toys with next All Fools' Day. The Senate did vote me the brocaded gown, and as a mark of honor to Germanicus, who was now in the middle of a new successful campaign in Germany, proposed to decree me a seat in the House among the ex-consuls. But Tiberius here interposed his veto, telling them that I was, in his opinion, incapable of delivering a speech on matters of state, which would not be a trial of his fellow members' patience. There was another decree proposed at the same time, which he also vetoed. The circumstances were as follows. Agrippina had been delivered of her child, a girl called Agrippinilla, at Cologne. And I must say at once that this Agrippinilla turned out one of the very worst of the Claudians, in fact. I may say that she shows signs of outdoing all her ancestors and ancestresses in arrogance and vice. Agrippina was ill for some months after her delivery, and unable to keep Caligula in hand properly, so he was sent away on a visit to Rome as soon as Germanicus began his spring campaign. The child became a sort of national hero. Whenever he went out for a walk with his brothers, he was cheered and stared at and made much of. Not yet 3 years old, but marvelously precocious, he was a most difficult case, only pleasant when flattered, and only docile when treated firmly. He came to stay with his great-grandmother, Livia, but she had no time to look after him properly, and because he was always getting into mischief and quarreling with his elder brothers, he came from her to live with my mother and me. My mother never flattered him, but neither did she treat him with enough firmness, until one day he spat at her in a fit of temper, and she gave him a good spanking. "You horrid old German woman," he said, "I'll burn your German house down." He is German, as the worst insult he knew. And that afternoon he sneaked away into a lumber room which was next to the slave's attic and full of old furniture and rubbish, and there set fire to a heap of worn-out straw mattresses. The fire soon swept the whole upper story, and since it was an old house with dry rot in the beams and draught holes in the flooring, there was no putting it out even with an endless bucket chain to the carp pool. I managed to save all my papers and valuables and some of the furniture, and no lives were lost except two old slaves who were lying sick in bed. But nothing was left of the house except the bare walls and the cellars. Caligula was not punished, because the fire had given him such a great fright. He nearly got caught in it himself, hiding guiltily under his bed until the smoke drove him screaming out. Well, the Senate wanted to decree that my house should be rebuilt at the expense of the state, on the ground that it had been the home of so many distinguished members of my family. But Tiberius would not allow this. He said that the outbreak of the fire had been due to my negligence, and that the damage could easily have been confined to the attics, if I had acted in a responsible way, and rather than that, the state should pay he undertook to rebuild and refurnish the house himself. Loud applause from the house. This was most unjust and dishonest, particularly as he had no intention of keeping his undertaking. I was forced to sell my last important piece of property in Rome, a block of houses near the cattle market, and a large building site adjoining, to rebuild the house at my own expense. I never told Germanicus that Caligula had been the incendiary, because he would have felt obliged to make good the damage himself, and I suppose it was, in a way, an accident, because one couldn't hold so young a child responsible. When Germanicus's men went out to fight the Germans again, they had a new addition to the ballad of Augustus's 3 griefs, of which I recalled 2 or 3 verses, and odd lines of others, most of them ridiculous. "6 gold bits a man he left us, for to buy us pork and beans, for to buy us cheese and cracknels in the German dry canteens. God Augustus walks in heaven, Ghost Marcellus swims in Styx. Julia's dead and gone to join him. That's the end of Julia's tricks. But our eagles still are straying, and by shame and sorrow stirred, to the tomb of God Augustus will bring back each wandering bird." There was another which began, "German Hermann lost his sweetheart and his little pot of beer." But I can't remember the finish, and the verse is not important, except as remind me to tell of Hermann's sweetheart. She was the daughter of a chieftain called, in German, Sextus, or something of the sort. But his Roman name was Segestes. He had been to Rome like Hermann, and enrolled among the knights, and unlike Hermann, had felt morally bound to the oath of friendship he had sworn to Augustus. It was this Segestes who had warned Varus about Hermann and Segamarus, and suggested that Varus should arrest them at the bequest to which he had invited them just before. It was this Segestes who had warned Varus about Hermann and Segamiras, and suggested that Varus should arrest them at the banquet to which he had invited them just before his unfortunate expedition started. Segestes had a favorite daughter whom Hermann had carried off and married, and Segestes never forgave him for this injury. He could not, however, come out openly on the side of the Romans against Hermann, who was a national hero. All that he had been able to do as yet was to maintain a secret correspondence with Germanicus, giving him intelligence of military movements, and constantly assuring him that he had never wavered in his loyalty to Rome, and was only waiting for an opportunity to make proof of it. But now he wrote to Germanicus that he was being besieged in his stockaded village by Hermann, who had sworn to give no quarter, and that he could not hold out much longer. Germanicus made a forced march, defeated the besieging force, which was not numerous. Hermann himself was away, wounded, and rescued Segestes. When he found that he had a valuable prize awaiting him, Hermann's wife, who had been visiting her father when the quarrel broke out between them and her husband, and who was far gone in pregnancy. Germanicus treated Segestes and his household very kindly, giving them an estate on the western side of the Rhine. Hermann, who was enraged at his wife's capture, feared that Germanicus's Hermann, who was enraged at his wife's capture, feared that Germanicus's clemency might induce other German chieftains to make overtures of peace. He built up a strong new confederation of tribes, including some which had always hitherto been friendly to Rome. Germanicus was undaunted. The more Germans he had in the field openly against him, the better he was pleased. He had never trusted them as allies. And before the summer was out, he had beaten them in a series of battles, forced Segamiras to surrender, and won back the first of the 3 lost eagles, that of the 19th Regiment. He also visited the scene of Varus's defeat, and gave the bones of his comrades in arms a decent burial, laying the first sod of their tomb with his own hands. The general, who had behaved so supinely in the mutiny, fought bravely at the head of his corps, and on one occasion turned what had seemed a hopeless defeat into a credible victory. Premature news that this battle was lost and that the conquering Germans were marching towards the Rhine caused such consternation at the nearest bridge that the captain of the guard gave his men orders to retreat across it and then break it down, which would have meant abandoning everyone on the other side of their fate. But Agrippina was there and countermanded the order. She told the men that she was the captain of the guard now, and would remain so until her husband returned to relieve her of her command. When eventually the victorious troops came marching back, she was at her post to welcome them. Her popularity now almost equaled that of her husband. She had organized a hospital for the wounded as Germanicus sent them back after each battle, and had given them the best available medical treatment. Ordinarily, wounded soldiers remained with their units until they either died or recovered. The hospital she paid for out of her own purse. But I mentioned the death of Julia. When Tiberius became emperor, Julia's daily supply of food at Regio was reduced to 4 ounces of bread a day and 1 ounce of cheese. She was already in a consumption from the unhealthiness of her quarters, and this starvation diet soon carried her off. But there was still no news of Posthumus and Livia, until she was certain of his death, could not be easy in her mind. Chapter 17. Tiberius continued to rule with moderation and consulted the Senate before taking any step of the least political importance. But the Senate had been voting according to direction for so long that they seemed to have lost the power of independent decision, and Tiberius never made it plain which way he wanted them to vote, even when he was very anxious for them to vote one way or another. He wanted to avoid all appearance of tyranny, and yet to keep his position at the head of affairs. The Senate soon found that if he spoke with studied elegance in favor of a motion, he meant that he wanted it voted against, and that if he spoke with studied elegance against it, this meant that he wanted it passed, and that on the very few occasions when he spoke briefly and without any rhetoric, he meant to be taken literally. Gallus and an old wag called Haterius used to delight in making speeches in warm agreement with Tiberius, enlarging his arguments to a point only just short of absurdity, and then voting the way he really wanted them to vote, thus showing that they understood his tricks perfectly. This Haterius, in the debate about Tiberius's accession, had cried out, "O Tiberius, how long will you allow unhappy Rome to remain without a head?" which had offended him because he knew that Haterius saw through his intentions. The next day Haterius pursued the joke by falling at Tiberius's feet and pleading for pardon for not having been warm enough. Tiberius started back in disgust, but Haterius grabbed at his knees and Tiberius went over, catching the back of his head, a bang on the marble floor. Tiberius's German bodyguard did not understand what was happening and sprung forward to slaughter their master's assailant. Tiberius only just stopped them in time. Haterius excelled in parody. He had an enormous voice, a comic face, and great fertility of invention. Whenever Tiberius, in his speeches, introduced any painfully far-fetched or archaic phrase, Haterius would pick it up and make it the key word of his reply. Augustus had always said that the wheels of Haterius's eloquence needed a drag chain even when he was driving uphill. The slow-witted Tiberius was no match for Haterius. Gallus's gift was for mock zeal. Tiberius was extremely careful not to appear a candidate for any divine honors, and refused to allow himself to be spoken about as if he had any superhuman attributes. He did not even allow the provincials to build him temples. Gallus was therefore fond of referring, as if accidentally, to Tiberius as his sacred majesty. When Haterius, who was always ready to carry on the gag, rose to rebuke him for this incorrect way of speaking, he would apologize profusely and say that nothing was farther from his mind than to do anything in disobedience of the others of his sacred. Oh dear, it was so easy to fall into the mistaken way of speaking. 1,000 apologies once more. He meant contrary to the wishes of his honored friend and fellow senator Tiberius Nero Caesar Augustus. Not Augustus's fool. Haterius would say, not Augustus' fool, Haterius would say in a stage whisper. He's refused that title a dozen times. He only uses it when he writes letters to other monarchs. They had one trick which annoyed Tiberius more than any other. If he made a show of modesty when thanked by the Senate for performing some national service, such as undertaking to complete the temples which Augustus had left unfinished, they would praise his honesty in not taking credit for his mother's work, and congratulate Livia on having so dutiful a son. When they saw that there was nothing that Tiberius hated so much as hearing Livia praised, they kept it up. Haterius even suggested that just as the Greeks were called by their father's name, so Tiberius should be named after his mother, and that it should be a crime to call him other than Tiberius Liviades. Or perhaps Livigina would be the more correct Latin form. Gallus found another weak spot in Tiberius's armor, and that was his hatred of any mention of his stay at Rhodes. The most daring thing he did was to praise Tiberius one day for his clemency. It was the very day that news reached the city of Julia's death, and to tell the story of the teacher of rhetoric at Rhodes who had refused Tiberius's modest application to join his classes on the ground that there was no vacancy at present, saying that he must come back in 7 days, Gallus added. And what do you think? His sacred, I beg your pardon, I should say, what do you think my honored friend and fellow senator Tiberius Nero Caesar did on his recent accession to the monarchy, when the same impertinent fellow arrived to pay his respects to the new divinity? Did he cut off that impudent head and give it as a football to his German bodyguard? Not at all. With a wit only equalled by his clemency, he told him that he had no vacancies at present in the corps of flatterers, and that he must come back in 7 years. This was an invitation, I think, but the Senate had no reason to disbelieve it, and applauded so heartily that Tiberius had to let it go by as the truth. Tiberius at last silenced Haterius by saying very slowly one day, "You will please forgive me, Haterius, if I speak rather more frankly than it is usual for one senator to speak to another. But I must say that I think you are a dreadful bore and not in the least witty." Then he turned to the House. "You will forgive me, my lords, but I have always said, and will say again, that since you have been good enough to entrust such absolute power to me, I ought not to be ashamed to use it for the common good. If I use it now to silence buffoons who insult you as well as myself by their silly performances, I trust that I will earn your approval. You have always been kind and patient with me. Without Haterius, Gallus had to play a lone game." Though Tiberius hated his mother more than ever, he continued to let her rule him. All the appointments which he made to consulships or provincial governorships were really hers, and they were very sensible ones, the men being chosen for merit, not for family influence, or because they had flattered her, or done her some private service. For I must make it plain, if I have not already done so, and however criminal the means used by Livia to win the direction of affairs for herself, first through Augustus and then through Tiberius, she was an exceptionally able and just ruler, and it was only when she ceased to direct the system that she had built up that it went wrong. I have spoken of Sejanus, the son of the commander of the guards. He now succeeded to his father's command, and was one of the only 3 men to whom Tiberius in any way opened his mind. Thrasyllus was another. He had come to Rome with Tiberius, and never lost his hold on him. The third was a senator called Nerva. Thrasyllus never discussed state policy with Tiberius, and never asked for any official position, and when Tiberius gave him large sums of money, he accepted them casually, as if money were something of little importance to him. He had a big observatory in a dome-shaped room in the palace, which had windows of glass so clear and transparent that you hardly knew they were there. Tiberius used to spend a great deal of his time here with Thrasyllus, who taught him the rudiments of astrology and many other magic arts, including that of interpreting dreams in the Chaldean style. Sejanus and Nerva Tiberius seems to have chosen for their totally opposite characters. Nerva never made an enemy and never lost a friend. His one fault, if you may call it so, was that he kept silent in the presence of evil when speech would not remedy it. He was sweet-tempered, generous, courageous, utterly truthful, and was never known to stoop to the least fraud, even if good promised to come from doing so. If he had been in Germanicus's position, for instance, he would never have forged that letter, though his own safety and that of the empire had hung upon it. Tiberius made Nerva superintendent of the city aqueducts, and kept him constantly by him, I suppose by way of providing himself with a handy yardstick of virtue, as Sejanus certainly served as a handy yardstick of wickedness. Sejanus had, as a young man, been a friend of Gaius, on whose staff he had served in the East, and had been clever enough to foresee Tiberius's return to favor. He had contributed to it by reassuring Gaius that Tiberius meant what he said when he disclaimed any ambition to rule, and by urging him to write that letter of recommendations to Augustus. He let Tiberius know at the time that he had done this, and Tiberius wrote him a letter still in his possession, promising never to forget his services. Sejanus was a liar, but so fine a general of lies that he knew how to marshal them into an alert and disciplined formation. This was a clever remark of Gallus's. It is not mine, which would come off best in any skirmish with suspicions or any general engagement with truth. Tiberius envied him his talent as he envied Nerva his honesty. For though he had progressed far in the direction of evil, he still felt hampered by unaccountable impulses towards the good. It was Sejanus who first began poisoning his mind against Germanicus, telling him that a man who could forge a letter from his father in whatever circumstances was not to be trusted, and that Germanicus was really aiming at the monarchy, but was acting with caution, first winning the men's affection by bribery, and then making sure of their fighting capacities and his own leadership by the unnecessary campaign across the Rhine. As for Agrippina, Sejanus said she was a dangerously ambitious woman. Look how she had behaved, styled herself captain of the bridge, and welcomed the regiments on their return as if she were heaven knows who. That the bridge was in danger of being destroyed was probably an invention of her own. Sejanus also said that he knew from a freedman of his, who had once been a slave in Germanicus's household, that Agrippina somehow believed Livia and Tiberius responsible for the death of her 3 brothers and the banishment of her sister, and had sworn to be revenged. Sejanus also began discovering all kinds of plots against Tiberius and kept him in constant fear of assassination while assuring him that he need not have the least anxiety with himself on guard. He encouraged Tiberius to cross Livia in trifling ways, to show her that she overestimated the strength of her position. It was he who, a few years later, organized the guards into a disciplined body. Hitherto, the 3 battalions stationed at Rome had been billeted by sections in various parts of the city, in inns and such like places, and were difficult to fetch out on parade in a hurry, and slovenly in their dress and movements. He suggested to Tiberius that if he built a single permanent camp for them outside the city, it would give them a strong corporate sense, prevent them from being influenced by the rumors and waves of political feeling which were always running through the city, and attach them more closely to his person as their emperor. Tiberius improved on his advice by recalling the remaining 6 battalions from their stations in other parts of Italy, and making the new camp big enough to house them all, 9,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, apart from the 4 city battalions, one of which he now sent to Lyons, and various colonies of discharged veterans. These were the only soldiers in Italy. The German bodyguard did not count as soldiers, being technically slaves, but they were picked men and more fanatically loyal to their emperor than any true-born Roman. There was not a man of them who really wanted to return to his cold, rude, barbarous land, though they were always singing sad choruses about it. They had too good a time here. As for the criminal dossiers to which Tiberius, because of his fear of plots against his life, was most anxious now to have access, Livia still pretended that the key to the cipher was lost. Tiberius, at Sejanus's suggestion, told her that since they were of no use to anyone, he would burn them. She said that he could do so if he liked, but surely it would be better to keep them, just in case the key turned up. Perhaps she might even suddenly remember the key. "Very well, mother," he answered. "I'll take charge of them until you do, and meanwhile I'll spend my evenings trying to work the cipher out myself." So he took them off to his own room and locked them in a cupboard. He tried his hardest to find the key to that cipher, but it beat him. The common cipher was simply writing Latin E for Greek alpha, Latin F for Greek beta, G for gamma, H for delta, and so on. The key of the high cipher was next to impossible to discover. It was provided by the first 100 lines of the first book of the Iliad, which had to be read concurrently with the writing of the cipher, each letter in the writing being represented by the number of letters of the alphabet intervening between it and the corresponding letter in Homer. Thus, the first letter of the first word of the first line of the first book of the Iliad is Mu. Suppose the first letter of the first word of any entry in the dossier to be upsilon. There are 7 letters in the Greek alphabet intervening between mu and upsilon. So upsilon would be written as 7. In this plan, the alphabet would be thought of as circular. Omega, the last letter, following alpha, the first, so that the distance between upsilon and alpha would be 4, but the distance between alpha and upsilon would be 18. It was Augustus's invention and must have taken rather a long time to write and decode, but I suppose by practice they came to know the distance between any 2 letters in the alphabet without having to count up, which saved a lot of time. And how do I know about all this? Because many, many years later, when the dossiers came into my possession, I worked the cipher out myself. I happened to find a roll of the first book of Homer, written on sheepskin, filed among the other rolls. It was clear that the first 100 lines only had been studied, because the sheepskin was badly soiled and inked at the beginning, and quite clear at the end. When I looked closer and saw the tiny figures, 6, 23, and 12, faintly scratched under the letters of the first line, it was not difficult to connect them with the cipher. I was surprised that Tiberius had overlooked this clue. Speaking of the alphabet, I was interested at this time in a simple plan for making Latin truly phonetic. It seemed to me that 3 letters were missing. These 3 were consonantal, U, to distinguish it from U, the vowel, a letter to correspond to the Greek upsilon, which is a vowel between Latin I and U. For use in Greek words which have become Latinized, and a letter to denote the double consonant, which we now write in Latin as B's, but pronounce, like the Greek, psi instead of BS. It was important, I wrote, for provincials learning Latin to learn it correctly. If the letters did not correspond to the sound, how could they avoid mistakes in pronunciation? So I suggested for consonantal U, the upside down F, which is used for that purpose in Etruscan. Thus, Lafinia instead of Luwinia. And a broken H for Greek upsilon. Thus, Bibliotheca instead of Bibliotheca. And an upside down C for BS. Thus, Eque for absque. The last letter was not so important, but the other 2 seemed to me essential. I suggested the broken H and the upside down F and C because these would cause the least trouble to men who use letter punches for metal or clay. They would not have to make any new punches. I published the book, and 1 or 2 people said that my suggestions were sensible, But of course, it had absolutely no result. My mother told me that there were three impossible things in the world: that chops should stretch across the bay from Baiae to Puteoli, that I should subdue the island of Britain, and that any one of these absurd new letters would ever appear on public inscriptions in Rome. I have always remembered this remark of hers, for it had a sequel. My mother was extremely short-tempered with me these days because our house took such a long time to rebuild, and the new furniture I bought was not equal to the old, and because her income was greatly reduced by the share she took in these expenses. I could not have found all the money myself. We lived for 2 years in quarters at the palace, not very good ones, and she vented her irritation on me so constantly that in the end I could not bear it any longer, and moved out of Rome to my villa near Capua, only visiting the city when my priestly functions demanded it, which was not often. You will ask about Urgel Lanilla. She never came to Capua. In Rome, we had little to do with each other. She scarcely greeted me when we met, and took no notice of me except for appearance's sake, when guests were present, and we always slept apart. She seemed fond enough of our boy, Drusillus, but did little for him in any practical way. His bringing up was left to my mother, who managed the household, and never called on Urgalanilla for any help. My mother treated Drusillus as if he were her own child, and somehow contrived to forget who his parents were. I never learned to like Drusillus myself. He was a surly, stolid, insolent child, and my mother scolded me so often in his presence that he learned to have no respect for me. I don't know how Urgalanilla got through her days, but she never seemed bored and ate enormously and, so far as I know, entertained no secret lovers. This strange creature had one passion, though. Numentina, the wife of my brother-in-law, Sylvanus, a little fair-haired, elf-like creature, who had once done or said something, I don't know what, which had penetrated through that thick-hide and muscular bulging body and touched what served Urgalanilla for a heart. Urgalanilla had a life-size portrait of Numentina in her boudoir. She used, I believe, to sit gazing at it for hours whenever there was no opportunity for gazing at Numentina herself. When I moved to Capua, Urgalanilla stayed at Rome with my mother and Drusillus. The only inconvenience of Capua as a home for me was the absence of a good library. However, I began a book for which a library was not needed, a history of Etruria. I had by now made some progress in Etruscan, and Erons, with whom I spent a few hours every day, was most helpful in giving me access to the archives of the half-ruined temple. He told me that he had been born on the day that the comet appeared which had announced the beginning of the 10th and last cycle of the Etruscan race. A cycle is a period reckoned by the longest life, that is to say, a cycle does not close until the death of everyone who was alive at the festival celebrating the close of the previous cycle. The Etruscans reckoned it at 110 years. This was the last cycle, and it would end with the total disappearance of Etruscan as a spoken language. The prophecy was already as good as fulfilled because he had no successors in his priestly office, and the country people now talked Latin, even in the home. So he was glad to help me to write my history, he said, as a mausoleum for the traditions of a once great race. I started it in the second year of Tiberius's reign, and I finished it 21 years later. I consider it my best work. Certainly I worked hardest at it. So far as I know, there is no other book on the subject of the Etruscans at all, and they were a very interesting race indeed. So I think that historians of the future will be grateful to me. I had Callan and Pallas with me, and lived a quiet, orderly life. I took an interest in the farm attached to my villa, and enjoyed occasional visits from my friends in Rome, who came out for a holiday. There was a woman permanently living with me, called Acte, a professional prostitute, and a very decent woman. I never had any trouble with her in the 15 years she was with me. Our relationship was a purely business one. She had deliberately chosen prostitution as her profession. I paid her well. There was no nonsense about her. We were quite fond of each other in a way. At last, she told me that she wanted to retire on her earnings. She would marry a decent man, an old soldier for choice, and settle down in one of the colonies and have children before it was too late. She had always wanted to have a house full of children. So I kissed her and said goodbye and gave her enough dowry money to make things very easy for her. She did not go away, though, until she had found me a successor whom she could trust to treat me properly. She found me Calpurnia, who was so like her that I have often thought she must have been her daughter. Acte did once mention having had a daughter whom she had put out to nurse because one couldn't be a prostitute and a mother at the same time. Well, so Acte married an ex-guardsman who treated her quite well and had 5 children by her. I have always kept an eye on that family. I mention her only because my readers will wonder what sort of sexual life I led when living apart from Urgulanilla. I do not think it is natural for an ordinary man to live long without a woman, and since Urgulanilla was impossible as a wife, I do not think that I can be blamed for living with Acte. Acte and I had an understanding that while we were together, we would neither of us have to do with anyone else. This was not sentiment, but a medical precaution. There was so much venereal disease now in Rome. Another fatal legacy, by the way, of the Punic War. No doubt. Here I wish to put it on record that I have never at any time of my life practiced homosexuality. I do not use Augustus's argument against it, that it prevents men having children to support the state, but I have always thought it at once pitiful and disgusting to see a full-grown man, a magistrate, perhaps with a family of his own, slobbering luxuriously over a plump little boy with a painted face and bangles, or an ancient senator playing Queen Venus to some tall young Adonis of the Guards cavalry, who tolerates the old fool only because he has money. When I had to go up to Rome, I stayed there for as short a time as possible. I felt something uncomfortable in the atmosphere on the Palatine Hill, which may well have been the growing tension between Tiberius and Livia. He had begun building a huge palace for himself on the northwest of the hill, and now moved into the lower rooms before the upper ones were finished, leaving her in sole possession of Augustus's palace. Livia, as if to show that Tiberius's new building, though 3 times the size, would never have the prestige of the old one, put a magnificent gold statue of Augustus in her hall and proposed as high priestess of his cult to invite all the senators and their wives to the dedicatory banquet. But Tiberius pointed out that he must first ask the Senate to vote on the matter. It was a state occasion, not a private entertainment. He so managed the debate that the banquet was held in 2 parts simultaneously, the senators in the hall with himself as host, and their wives in a big room leading off it with Livia as hostess. She swallowed the insult by not treating it as such, only as a sensible arrangement, more in keeping with what Augustus would have wished himself, but gave orders to the palace cooks that the women were to be served first with the best joints and sweetmeats and wine. She also appropriated the most costly dishes and drinking vessels for her feast. She got the better of him on that occasion, and the senators' wives all had a good laugh at the expense of Tiberius and their husbands. Another uncomfortable thing about coming to Rome was that I never seemed to be able to avoid meeting Sejanus. I disliked having anything to do with him, though he was always studiously polite to me and never did me any direct injury. I was astonished that a man with a face and manner like his, and not well born, or a famous fighter, or even particularly rich, could have made such a huge success in the city. He was now the next most important man after Tiberius, and extremely popular with the guards. It was a completely untrustworthy face, sly, cruel, and irregular featured, and the one thing that held it together was a certain animal hardiness and resolution. What was stranger still to me, several women of good family were said to be rivals in love for him. He and Castor got on badly together, which was only natural, for there were rumors that Livilla and Sejanus had some sort of understanding, but Tiberius seemed to have complete confidence in him. I have mentioned Brasius, my mother's old freedwoman. When I told her that I was leaving Rome and settling at Capua, she said how much she would miss me, but that I was wise to go. I had a funny dream about you last night, Master Claudius, if you'll forgive me. You were a little lame boy, and thieves broke into his father's house and murdered his father, and a whole lot of relations and friends. But he squeezed through the pantry window and went hobbling into the neighboring wood. He climbed up a tree and waited. The thieves came out of the house and sat down under the tree, where he was hiding, to divide the plunder. Soon they began to quarrel about who should have what, and one of the thieves got killed, and then 2 more, and then the rest began drinking wine and pretending to be great friends, and the wine had been poisoned by one of the murdered thieves. So they all died in agony. The lame boy climbed down the tree and collected the valuables and found a lot of gold and jewels among them that had been stolen from other families. But he took it all home with him and became quite rich. I smiled. That's a funny dream, Brasius. But he was still as lame as ever, and all that wealth could not buy his father and family back to life again. Could it? No, my dear, but perhaps he married and had a family of his own. So choose a good tree, Master Claudius, and don't come down till the last of the thieves are dead. That's what my dream said. I'll not come down even then if I can help it, Brasius. I don't want to be the receiver of stolen goods. You can always give them back, Master Claudius. This was all very remarkable in the light of what happened later. I have no great faith in dreams. Athenodorus once dreamed that there was treasure in a badger's den in the wood near Rome. He found his way to the exact spot which he had never visited before, and there, in a bank, was the hole leading to the den. He fetched a couple of countrymen to dig away the bank until they came to the den at the end of the hole, where they found a rotten old purse containing 6 mouldy coppers and a bad shilling, which was not enough to pay the countrymen for their work. And one of my tenants, a shopkeeper, dreamed once that a flight of eagles wheeled round his head and one settled on his shoulder. He took it for a sign that he would one day be emperor, but all that happened was that a piquet of guards visited him the next morning. They had eagles on their shields, and the corporal arrested him for some offense that brought him under military jurisdiction. Chapter 18. One summer afternoon at Capua, I was sitting on a stone bench behind the stables of my villa, thinking out some problem of Etruscan history, and idly shooting dice. Left hand against right, on the rough plank table in front of me, a raggedly dressed man came up and asked whether I was Tiberius, Claudius Drusus Nero Germanicus. He had been directed here from Rome, he said. This is in AD 16. I have a message for you, sir. I don't know whether it's worth delivering, but I'm an old soldier on the tramp, one of your father's veterans, sir. And you know what it is. I'm glad of having an excuse for taking one road rather than another. Who gave you the message? A fellow I met in the woods near Cape Causa. Curious sort of fellow. He was dressed like a slave, but he spoke like a Caesar. A big, thick, set fellow, and looked half-starved. What name did he give? No name at all. He said you know who he was by the message, and be surprised to hear from him. He made me repeat the message twice to make sure I had it right. I was to say that he was still fishing, but that a man couldn't live wholly on fish, and that you were to pass the word to his brother-in-law, and that if the milk was sent, it never reached him, and that he wanted a little book to read, at least 7 pages long, and that you were not to do anything until you heard from him again. Does that make sense, sir? Or was the fellow cracked? When he said that, I could not believe my ears. Posthumus! But Posthumus was dead. Has he a big jaw, blue eyes, and a way of tilting his head on one side when he asks you a question? That's the man, sir. I poured him out a drink, with a hand so shaky that I spilt as much as I poured. Then, signing that he was to wait there for me, I went into the house. I found 2 good plain gowns, and some underclothes, and sandals, and a pair of razors, and some soap. Then I took the first sewn sheet book that came to hand. It happened to be a copy of some recent speeches of Tiberius to the Senate, and on the 7th page I wrote in milk, "What joy! I shall write to G at once. Be careful. Send for whatever you need. Where can I see you? My dearest love to you. Here are 20 gold pieces, all I have at the moment, but quick gifts are double gifts, I hope. I waited for the page to dry, and then gave the man the book and clothes wrapped in a bundle. And a purse, I said. Take these 30 gold pieces. 10 are for yourself. 20 are for the man in the woods. Bring back a message from him, and you shall have 10 more. But keep your mouth shut, and be back soon. Good enough, sir, he said. I'll not fail you. But what's to prevent me from going off with this bundle and all the money? I said, if you were a dishonest man, you wouldn't ask that question. So let us have another drink together, and off you go. To cut a long story short, he went away with the bundle and money, and a few days later brought me back a verbal answer from Posthumus, which was thanks for the money and clothes, and that I was not to seek him out, but that the crocodile's mother would know where he was, and that his name was now Pantherus, and would I forward him his brother-in-law's answer as soon as possible. I paid the old soldier the 10 pieces I had promised him, and 10 more for his faithfulness. I understood whom Posthumus meant by the crocodile's mother. The crocodile was an old freedman of Agrippa's, whom we call that because of his torpidity and greed and his enormous jaw. He had a mother living at Perusia, where she kept an inn. I knew the place well. I sent off a letter to Germanicus at once to tell him the news. I sent it by Pallas to Rome, telling him to send it off with the next post to Germany. In the letter I merely said that Posthumus was alive and in hiding. I did not say where, and begged Germanicus to acknowledge the receipt of the letter at once. Then I waited and waited for an answer, but none came. I wrote again, rather more fully, but still no answer. I sent a message to the crocodile's mother by a country carrier that no message had yet arrived for Pantherus from his brother-in-law. I did not hear again from Posthumus. He did not wish to compromise me further, and now that he had money and was able to move about without being arrested on suspicion as a runaway slave, he was not dependent on my help. Somebody at the inn recognized him, and he had to move from there for safety's sake. Very soon the rumor that he was alive was all over Italy. Everyone was talking about it at Rome. A dozen people, including 3 senators, came out to me from the city to ask me privately if it were true. I told them that I had not seen him, but that I had met someone who had, and that there was no doubt that it was Posthumus. In return, I asked them what they intended to do if he came to Rome, and won the support of the populace. But the directness of my question embarrassed and hurt them, and I got no answer. Posthumus was reported to have visited various country towns in the neighborhood of Rome, but apparently he took the precaution of not entering them before nightfall, and always going away in disguise before dawn. He was never seen publicly, but would lodge at some inn and leave behind a message of thanks for the kindness shown him, signed with his real name. At last, one day he landed at Ostia from a small coastal vessel. The port knew a few hours beforehand that he was coming, and he had a tremendous ovation at the quay as he stepped ashore. He chose to land at Ostia because it was the summer headquarters of the fleet, of which his father, Agrippa, had been admiral. His vessel flew a green pennant, which Augustus had given Agrippa the right to fly whenever he was at sea, and his sons after him, in memory of his sea victory of Actium. Agrippa's memory was honored at Ostia almost beyond that of Augustus. Postumus was in great danger of his life, being still under sentence of banishment and therefore outlawed by his public reappearance in Italy. He made a short speech of thanks to the crowd for their welcome. He said that if fortune was kind to him, and if he won back the esteem of the Roman Senate and people, which he had fortified because of certain lying accusations brought against him by his enemies, accusations which his grandfather, the god Augustus, had realized too late were untrue, he would reward the loyalty of the men and women of Ostia in no niggardly fashion. A company of guards was there with orders to arrest him, for Livia and Tiberius had got the news too, somehow, but the men would have had no choice against the crowd of sailors. The captain wisely made no attempt to carry out his commission. He ordered 2 men to change into sailors' slops and not lose sight of Postumus. But by the time they had changed, he had disappeared, and they could not find no trace of him. The next day, Rome was full of sailors, who picketed the principal streets. Whenever they met a knight or senator or public official, they asked him the password. The password was Neptune. And if he did not already know it, he was given it and made to repeat it 3 times unless he wanted a beating. Nobody wanted a beating, and popular feeling now ran so strongly in sympathy with Postumus and against Tiberius and Livia that if a single favorable word had come from Germanicus, the whole city, including the guards and the city battalions, would have come over to him at once. But without Germanicus's support, any rising in favor of Postumus could have meant civil war, and nobody had much confidence in Postumus's chances if it came to a struggle with Germanicus. In this crisis, the same Crispus, who had antagonized Tiberius 2 years before by sending Clement to his death on the island, but had been forgiven, came forward and offered to redeem his fault, by this time making sure of Postumus. Tiberius gave him a free hand. He found out somehow where Postumus' headquarters were, and going to him with a large sum of money, which he said was for the payment of his sailors, who had already lost 2 working days by the picketing work, he undertook to bring over the German bodyguard to Postumus's side as soon as he gave the signal. He had, he said, already given them enormous bribes. Postumus believed him. They arranged a meeting for 2 hours after midnight at a certain street corner where Postumus's sailors were also to assemble in force. They would march to Tiberius's palace. Crispus would order the bodyguard to admit Postumus, Tiberius, Castor, and Livia would be arrested, and Crispus said that Sejanus, while not active in the plot, had undertaken to bring the guards over in support of the new regime as soon as the first blow had been successfully struck, on condition that he retained his command. They would march to Tiberius's palace. Crispus would order the bodyguard to admit Posthumus. Tiberius, Castor, and Livia would be arrested, and Crispus said that Sejanus, while not active in the plot, had undertaken to bring the guards over in support of the new regime as soon as the first blow had been successfully struck, on condition that he retained his command. The sailors were punctual at the rendezvous, but Posthumus did not arrive. At that hour no citizens were in the strait. So when a combined force of Germans from the bodyguard and picked men of Sejanus suddenly fell on the sailors, who were mostly drunk and not in any regular formation, the password, Neptune, lost its power. Many of them were killed on the spot, many more as they broke and ran, and the rest never once slowed down. It is said, before they reached Ostia again, Crispus and 2 soldiers had waylaid Posthumus in a narrow alley between his headquarters and the rendezvous, stunned him with a sandbag, gagged and bound him, put him in a covered sedan, and carried him off to the palace. The next day, Tiberius made a statement to the Senate. A certain slave of Posthumus Agrippa's, called Clement, he said, had caused a deal of unnecessary alarm in the city by impersonating his dead former master. This bold fellow had run away from the provincial knight who had bought him when Posthumus's estate was sold, and had hidden in a wood on the coast of Tuscany until his beard grew long enough to hide his receding chin. The chief point of dissimilarity between himself and Posthumus, some rowdy sailors at Ostia had pretended to believe in him, but only as an excuse for marching to Rome and creating a disturbance there. They had assembled in the suburbs a little before dawn that morning under his leadership, with the object of marching to the center of the city and plundering shops and private houses. When challenged by a force of watchmen, they had dispersed and deserted their leader, who had since been put to death. So the house need have no further anxiety about the matter. I heard later that Tiberius pretended not to recognize Posthumus when he was brought before him at the palace, and asked him mockingly, "How did you happen to become one of the Caesars?" To which Posthumus answered, "In the same way and on the same day as you did. Have you forgotten?" Tiberius told the slave to strike Posthumus on the mouth for his insolence, and he was then put on the rack and asked to reveal his fellow conspirators. But he would only tell scandalous anecdotes of the private life of Tiberius, which were so disgusting and so circumstantial that Tiberius lost his temper and battered his face in with his great bony fist. The soldiers finished the bloody work by beheading him and hacking him into pieces in the cellar of the palace. What greater sorrow can there be than to mourn a beloved friend as murdered, at the close of a long and undeserved exile, too? And then, after the brief joy and astonishment of hearing that he has somehow cheated his executioners, to have to mourn him a second time, this time without hope of error and without even seeing him in the interval, as treacherously recaptured and shamefully tortured and killed. My one consolation was that when Germanicus heard what had happened, and I would at once write him the whole story so far as I knew it, he would leave his campaigns in Germany and march back to Rome at the head of as many regiments as could be spared from the Rhine and avenge Postumus's death on Livia and Tiberius. I wrote, but he did not answer. I wrote again, and still no answer. But eventually a long, affectionate letter came in which there was a wandering reference to the success which Clement had had in impersonating Postumus. How in the world had he managed to do it? From this sentence, it was quite clear that none of my important letters had arrived. The only one to arrive had been sent off by the same post as the second. In this I had merely given him particulars of the business matter which he had asked me to look into for him. He now thanked me for the information, which he said was exactly what he wanted. I realized with a sudden feeling of dread that Livia or Tiberius must have intercepted all the rest. My digestion had always been bad, and fear of poison in every dish did not improve it. My stammer returned, and I had attacks of asthma. My digestion had always been bad, and fear of poison in every dish did not improve it. My stammer returned, and I had attacks of aphasia. Sudden blanks in the mind which brought me into great ridicule. If they caught me in the middle of a sentence, I would finish it anyhow. The most unfortunate results of this weakness was that I made a mess of my duties as priest of Augustus, which hitherto I had carried out without cause for complaint from anyone. There is an old custom at Rome that if any mistake is made in the ritual of a sacrifice or other service, the whole thing has to be gone over again from the beginning. It now often happened when I was officiating that I would lose my way in a prayer and perhaps go on repeating the same sequence of sentences 2 or 3 times before I realized what I was doing. Or that I would take up the flint knife for cutting the victim's throat before sprinkling its head with the ritual flour and salt. And this sort of thing meant going back to the beginning again. It was tedious to make 3 or 4 attempts at a service before I could get through it perfectly, and the congregation used to get very restless. At last, I wrote to Tiberius as High Pontiff and asked to be relieved from all my religious duties for a year on the ground of ill health. He granted the request without comment. Chapter 19. Germanicus' third year of war against the Germans was more successful even than the first 2. He had worked out a new plan of campaign by which he would take the Germans by surprise and save his men a lot of dangerous and weary marching. This was to build on the Rhine a fleet of nearly 1,000 transports, embark with most of his forces, and sail down the river and by way of the canal that our father had once cut, through the Dutch lakes and by sea to the mouth of the Ems. This also in AD 16. Here he would anchor his transports on the near bank, except for a few which would serve for making a pontoon bridge. He would then attack the tribes across the Weser, a river fordable in places which runs parallel to the Ems, about 50 miles beyond. The plan worked well, in every detail. When the advance guard reached the Weser, they found Hermann and some allied chieftains waiting on the further bank. Hermann shouted across to ask whether Germanicus was in command. When they answered yes, he asked whether they would take him a message. The message was Hermann's courteous greetings to Germanicus, and might he be permitted speech with his brother. This was a brother of Hermann's, called in German something like Goldkopf, or at any rate a name so barbarous that it was impossible to transliterate it into Latin, as Hermann had been made into Arminius, or as Sigmergeth into Segemirus. So it was translated as Flavius, meaning the golden-headed Flavius that had been in the Roman army for years, and being at Lyons at the time of the disaster of Varus, had there made a declaration of his continued loyalty to Rome, repudiating all the family ties which bound him to his treacherous brother Hermann. In the next year's campaign of Tiberius and Germanicus, he had fought bravely and lost an eye. Germanicus asked Flavius whether he wished to address his brother. Flavius said he didn't much want to, but that it might be an offer to surrender. So the two brothers started shouting at each other across the river. Hermann began talking German, but Flavius said that unless he talked Latin, the conversation was at an end. Hermann did not want to talk Latin, which the other chiefs did not understand for fear of being thought a traitor, and Flavius did not want to be thought a traitor by the Romans, who did not understand German. On the other hand, Hermann wanted to make an impression on the Romans, and Flavius on the Germans. Hermann tried to keep to German, and Flavius to Latin. But as they grew more and more heated, they fell into such a dreadful mixture of both languages that, as Germanicus wrote to me, it was as good as a comedy to hear them. I quote from Germanicus's account of the dialogue. Hermann: "Hullo, brother! What's happened to your face? That scar's an awful deformity. Lost an eye?" Flavius: "Yes, brother. Did you happen to pick one up? I lost it that day you galloped away out of the wood with mud smeared on your shield so that Germanicus wouldn't recognize you." Hermann: "You're wrong, brother. That wasn't me. You must have been drinking again. You were always like that, before a battle. A bit nervous, unless you had a drink, at least a gallon of beer, and had to be strapped to the saddle by the time the war horn sounded." Flavius: "That's a lie, of course, but it reminds me what a barbarous, gut-rotting drink your German beer is. I never drink it now, even when there's a great consignment come into the camp from one of your captured villages. The men only drink it when they have to. They say that it's better than swamp water, spoilt by German corpses." Hermann: "Yes, I like Roman wine myself. I have a few hundred jars left of what I captured from Varus. This summer I'll be getting in another good supply if Germanicus doesn't look out. By the way, what reward did you get for losing your eye?" Flavius, with great dignity: "The personal thanks of the commander-in-chief, and 3 decorations, including the crown and the chain." Hermann: "Ho, ho, the chain! Do you wear it around your ankles, you Roman slave?" Flavius: I'd rather any day be a slave to the Romans than a traitor to them. By the way, your dear Trusnelda's very well, and so's your boy. When are you coming to Rome to visit them? Herman. At the end of this campaign, brother. Ho, ho. Flavius. You mean when you walk behind Germanicus's car in the Triumph, and the crowd pelts you with rotten eggs? How I'll laugh. Herman. You had better do all your laughing in advance, because if you still have any throat left to laugh through in 3 days from now, my name's not Herman. But enough of this. I have a message to you from your mother. Flavius, suddenly serious, and fetching a deep sigh. Ah, my dear, dear mother, what message does my mother send me? Have I her sacred blessing still, brother? Herman. Brother, you have wounded our wise and noble and prolific mother to the soul. She says that she will turn her blessing into a curse if you continue to be a traitor to your family and tribe and race, and do not instantly come over to us again and act as joint general with me. Flavius, in general, bursting into tears of rage. Oh, she never said that, Herman. She couldn't have said that. It's a lie you made up yourself just to make me unhappy. Confess it's a lie, Herman. Herman. She gave you 2 days to make up your mind. Flavius, to his groom. Hi, you ugly-faced pig. Give me my horse and arms. I'm going over the stream to fight my brother. Herman, you foul thing, I'm coming to fight you. Herman. Come on, then. You one-eyed bean-eating slave, you. Flavius jumped on his horse and was about to swim it across the river when a Roman colonel caught at his leg and pulled him off the saddle. He knew German, and he knew the absurd veneration that Germans have for their wives and mothers. Suppose Flavius really meant to desert. So he told him not to bother about Herman or believe his lies. But Flavius couldn't resist having the last word. He dried his eyes and shouted across. I saw your father-in-law last week. He's got a nice place near Lyons. He told me that Trusnelda came to him because she couldn't bear the disgrace of being married to a man who broke his solemn oath as an ally of Rome and betrayed a friend at whose table he had eaten. She said that the only way you can ever win back her esteem is by not using the arms which she gave you on your wedding day against your sworn friends. She has not been unfaithful to you yet, but that won't last long if you don't instantly come to your senses. Then it was Herman's turn to weep and storm and accuse Flavius of telling lies. Germanicus privately detailed a captain to watch Flavius very carefully during the next battle, and at the least sign of treachery to run him through. Germanicus wrote seldom, but when he did, they were long letters, and he put into them, he said, all the interesting and amusing things that did not seem quite suitable for his official dispatches to Tiberius. I lived for those letters. I was never anxious about Germanicus's safety when he was fighting the Germans. He had the same sort of confidence with them as an experienced beekeeper has with bees, who can go boldly to a hive and remove the honey, and the bees somehow never sting him as they would you or me if we tried to do the same thing. 2 days after fording the Weser, he fought a decisive battle with Herman. I have always been interested in speeches made before a battle. There is nothing that throws such light on the character of a general. Germanicus neither harangued his men in an oratorical way, nor joked obscenely with them like Julius Caesar. He was always very serious, very precise, and very practical. His speech on the occasion was about what he really thought of the Germans. He said that they were not soldiers, they had a certain bravado, and fought well in a mob, as wild cattle fight, and they had a certain animal cunning, too, which made it unwise to neglect ordinary precautions in fighting them. But they soon tired after their first furious charge, and they had no discipline in any true military sense, only a spirit of mutual rivalry. Their chiefs could never count on them to do what was wanted. Either they did too much or not enough. The Germans, he said, are the most insolent and boastful nation in the world when things go well with them, but once they are defeated, they are the most cowardly and abject. Never trust a German out of your sight, and never be afraid of him when you have him face to face. And that's all that need be said, except this. Most of the fighting tomorrow will be in among those woods, where from all accounts the enemy will be so tightly packed that they will have no room for maneuver. Go straight at them. Never mind their assieges. And get to close quarters at once. Stab at their faces. That is what they hate most. Hermann had chosen his battleground carefully. A narrowing plan, lying between the Weser and a range of wooded hills. He would fight at the narrow end of this plain, with a big oak and birch forest at his back, the river on his right, and the hills on his left. The Germans were in 3 detachments. The first of these, young Agasagi, The Germans were in 3 detachments. The first of these, young Asigi men of local tribes, were to advance into the plain against the leading Roman regiments, who would probably be French auxiliaries, and drive them back. Then, when the Roman supports came up, they were to break off the fight and pretend to fly in panic. The Romans would press on towards the wood, and at this point the second detachment, consisting of Hermann's own tribe, would charge down from an ambush on the hill and take them in the flank. This would cause great confusion, and the first detachment would then return closely supported by the third, the experienced elder men of the local tribes, and drive the Romans into the river. The German cavalry, by this time, would have come round from behind the hill and taken the Romans in the rear. It would have been a good plan if Hermann had been in command of disciplined troops, but it went ludicrously wrong. Germanicus's order of battle was as follows. First, 2 regiments of French heavy infantry on the river flank, and 2 of the auxiliary Germans on the mountain flank. Then the foot archers, then 4 regular regiments, then Germanicus with 2 guards battalions, and the regular cavalry, then 4 more regular regiments, then the French mounted archers, then the French light infantry. As the German auxiliaries advanced along the spurs of the mountain, Hermann, who was watching events from the top of a pine tree, called out excitedly to his nephew, who was standing by for orders below. "There goes my traitor brother. He must never leave this battle alive." The stupid nephew sprang forward, shouting, "Hermann's orders are to charge at once." He rushed down into the plain with about half the tribe. Again. He rushed down into the plain with about half the tribe. Hermann, with difficulty, managed to restrain the rest. Germanicus sent the regular cavalry out at once to charge the fools in the flank before they could reach Flavius's men, and the French mounted archers to cut off their retreat. The German skirmishing detachment had meanwhile advanced from the wood, but the Roman cavalry charge sent the men under Hermann's nephew rushing back on top of them, and they caught the panic and ran back too. The German third detachment, the main body, then came out of the wood, expecting the skirmishers to halt and turn back with them as arranged. But the skirmishers' only thought was to get away from the cavalry. They ran back through the main body. At this moment there came a most cheering omen for the Romans. 8 eagles, who had been frightened from the hill by the sortie and were wheeling about the plain, uttering loud shrieks, now flew all together towards the wood. Germanicus called out, "Follow the eagles! Follow the Roman eagles!" The whole army took up the cry, "Follow the eagles!" Meanwhile, Hermann had charged with the rest of his men and taken the foot archers by surprise, killing a number of them. But the rear regiment of French heavy infantry wheeled round to the archers' assistance. Hermann's force, which consisted of some 15,000 men, might still have saved the battle by crushing the French infantry and thus driving a formidable wedge between the Roman advance guard and the main body. But the sun flashed in their faces from the weapons and breastplates and shields and helmets of the long ranks of advancing regular infantry, and the Germans lost courage. Most of them rushed back to the hill. Hermann rallied 1,000 or two, but not enough, and by this time 2 squadrons of irregular cavalry had come charging back among the fugitives and cut off his retreat to the hill. How he got away is a mystery, but it is generally believed that he spurred his horse towards the woods and overtook the German auxiliaries, who were advancing to attack it. Then he shouted, "Make way, cattle! I'm Hermann." Nobody dared to kill him, because he was Flavius's brother, and Flavius would feel bound in family honor to avenge his death. It was no longer a battle, but a slaughter. The German main body was outflanked and forced towards the river, which many men managed to swim, but not all. Germanicus pushed his second line of regular infantry into the wood and routed the skirmishers, who were waiting there in the vague hope of the battle suddenly turning in their favor. The archers had good sport shooting down Germans who had climbed trees and were hiding in the foliage at the top. All resistance was now over. From 9 o'clock in the morning until 7 o'clock in the evening, when it began to get dark, the killing went on. For 10 miles beyond the battlefield, the woods and plains were scattered with German corpses. Among the captives was the mother of Hermann and Flavius. She begged for life, saying that she had always tried to persuade Hermann to abandon his futile resistance to the Roman conquerors, so Flavius's loyalty was now assured. A month later, another battle was fought in thick forest land on the banks of the Elbe. Hermann had chosen an ambush and made dispositions which might have been most effective if Germanicus had not heard all about them a few hours beforehand from deserters. As it was, instead of the Romans being driven into the river, the Germans were forced back through the wood, in which they were packed so closely for their usual strike and run tactics, back into a quaking bog which surrounded it, where thousands slowly sank out of sight, yelling with rage and despair. Hermann, who had been disabled by an arrow wound in the previous battle, was not much to the fore this time, but he carried on the fight in the wood as stubbornly as he could, and, meeting by chance with his brother, Flavius, thrust him through with an assegai. He escaped across the bog, jumping from tussock to tussock with extraordinary nimbleness and good luck. Germanicus raised a huge trophy head of German weapons and put on it the following inscription: "The forces of Tiberius Caesar, having subdued the tribes between Rhine and Elbe, consecrate these memorials of their victory to Jove, to Mars, and to Augustus. No mention of himself. His total casualties in these two battles were not above 2,500 men killed and seriously wounded. The Germans must have lost at least 25,000. Germanicus considered that he had done enough this year and sent some of his men back to the Rhine by land and embarked the rest on transports. But then came misfortune. A sudden storm from the southwest caught the fleet soon after it weighed anchor and scattered it in all directions. Many vessels went to the bottom, and only Germanicus's own ship managed to reach the mouth of the Weser, where he reproached himself as a second Varus with the loss of the whole Roman army. He was, with difficulty, prevented by his friends from leaping into the sea to join the dead. However, a few days later, the wind veered round to the north, and one by one the scattered ships came back, almost all oarless, and some with cloaks spread instead of sails, the less disabled taking turns to tow the ones that could barely keep afloat. Germanicus set to work repairing the damaged hulls, and sent off as many of the fit vessels as he could to search the desolate neighboring islands for survivors. Many were found there, but in a half-starved state, kept alive only by shellfish and the carcasses of horses thrown up on the beach. Many more came in from points further up the coast. They had been respectfully treated by the inhabitants, who had lately been forced to swear alliance with Rome. About 20 shiploads returned from as far away as Britain, which had been paying a nominal tribute since its conquest 70 years before by Julius Caesar, sent back by the petty kings of Kent and Sussex. In the end, not more than a quarter of the lost men were accounted for, and nearly 200 of these were found years later in central Britain. They were rescued from the lead mines where they had been put to forced labor. The inland Germans, when they first heard of the disaster, thought that their gods had avenged them. They overthrew the battlefield trophy and even began talking of a march to the Rhine. But Germanicus suddenly struck again, sending an expedition of 60 infantry battalions and 100 cavalry squadrons against the tribes of the Upper Weser, while he himself marched with 80 more infantry battalions and another 100 cavalry squadrons against the tribes between the Lower Rhine and the Ems. Both expeditions were completely successful, and, what was better than the killing of many thousands Germans, the eagle of the 18th Regiment was found in an underground temple in a wood and triumphantly borne away. Only the eagle of the 17th now remained unredeemed, and Germanicus promised his men that next year, if he was still in command, they would rescue that too. Meanwhile, he marched them back to winter quarters. Then Tiberius wrote pressing him to come home for the triumph which had been decreed him, for he had surely done enough. Germanicus wrote back that he would not be content until he had altogether broken the power of the Germans, for which not many more battalions were now needed, and recovered the third eagle. Tiberius wrote again that Rome could not afford such high casualties, even at the reward of such splendid victories. He was not criticizing Germanicus's skills as a general, for his battles had been most economical in men, but between battle casualties and the sea disaster he had lost the equivalent of 2 whole regiments, which was more than Rome could afford. He reminded Germanicus that he had himself been sent 9 times into Germany by Augustus, and so was not talking without experience. His opinion was that it was not worth the life of a single Roman to kill even as many as 10 Germans. Germany was like a hydra. The more heads you lopped off, the more it grew. The best way of maintaining Germans was to play on their inter-tribal jealousies and foment war between neighboring chieftains, encouraging them to kill each other without outside help. Germanicus wrote back begging for 1 year more in which to complete his work of subjugation. But Tiberius told him that he was wanted at Rome as consul again, and touched him on his most tender spot by saying that he should remember his brother Castor. Germany was the only country now where any important war was being fought, and if he insisted on finishing it himself, Castor would have no opportunity of winning a triumph or the title of field marshal. Germanicus persisted no longer, but said that Tiberius's wishes were his law, and that he would return as soon as relieved. He came back in the early spring and celebrated his triumph. The whole population of Rome streamed out to welcome him 20 miles from the city. A great arch to commemorate the recovery of the eagles was dedicated near the temple of Saturn. This is AD 17. The triumphal procession passed under it. There were cars heaped with the spoil of German temples, and with enemy shields and weapons. Others carried tableaux representing battles or German river gods and mountain gods dominated by Roman soldiers. Trusnelda and her child were on one car, with halters about their necks, followed by an enormous train of manacled German prisoners. Germanicus rode, crowned in his chariot, with Agrippina seated beside him, and his 5 children, Nero, Drusus, Caligula, Agrippinella, and Drusilla, seated behind. He won more applause than any other triumphant general had won since Augustus's triumph after Actium. But I was not there. Of all places in the world, I was in Carthage, Only a month before Germanicus's return, I had been sent a note by Livia instructing me to prepare for a journey to Africa. A representative of the imperial family was needed to dedicate a new temple to Augustus at Carthage, and I was the only one who could be spared for the task. I would be given ample advice on how to conduct myself and how to perform the ceremony, and it was to be hoped I could not once more make a fool of myself even before African provincials. I guessed at once why I was being sent. There was no reason for anyone to go yet, because the temple would not be completed for at least another 3 months. I was being got out of the way. While Germanicus was in the city, I would not be allowed to return, and all my letters home would be opened. So I never had an opportunity of telling Germanicus what I had been saving up for him so long. On the other hand, Germanicus had his talk with Tiberius. He told him that he knew that Postumus's banishment had been due to a cruel plot on Livia's part. He had positive proof of it. Livia certainly ought to be removed from public affairs. Her actions could not be justified by any subsequent misbehavior of Postumus's. It was only natural for him to try to escape from undeserved confinement. Tiberius professed to be shocked by Germanicus's revelations, but said that he could not create public scandal by suddenly dishonoring his mother. He would charge her privately with the crime and gradually take away her powers. What he really did was to go to Livia and tell her exactly what Germanicus had said to him, adding that Germanicus was a credulous fool, but seemed to be in earnest, and was so popular at Rome and in the army that perhaps it would be advisable for Livia to convince him that she was not guilty of what he charged her, unless she thought this beneath her dignity. He added that he would send Germanicus away somewhere as soon as possible, probably to the east, and would raise the question again in the Senate of her being called Mother of the Country, a title which she had well deserved. He had taken exactly the right line with her. She was pleased that he still feared her sufficiently to tell her so much, and called him a dutiful son. She swore that she had not arranged false charges against Postumus. This story was probably invented by Agrippina, whom Germanicus followed blindly, and who was trying to persuade him to usurp the monarchy. Agrippina's plan, she said, was no doubt to make trouble between Tiberius and his loving mother. Tiberius, embracing her, said that though little disagreements might occasionally occur, nothing could break the ties that bound them. Livia then sighed. She was getting to be an old woman now. She was well on in her 70s and was beginning to find work too much for her. Perhaps he would anyhow relieve her of the more tedious part and only consult her on important questions of appointments and decrees. She would not even be offended if he discontinued his practice of putting her name above his on all official documents. She did not want it said that he was under her tutelage. But, she said, the sooner he persuaded the Senate to give her that title, the more pleased she would be. So there was a show of reconciliation, but neither trusted the other. Tiberius now named Germanicus as his colleague in the consulship, and told him that he had persuaded Livia to retire from public business, though, as a matter of form, he would still pretend to consult her. This seemed to satisfy Germanicus, but Tiberius did not feel at all comfortable. Agrippina would hardly speak to him, and knowing that Germanicus and she had only one soul between them, he could not believe in their continued loyalty. Besides, things were going on at Rome which a man of Germanicus's character would naturally detest. First of all, the informers. Since Livia would not give him access to the criminal dossiers or let him share the control of her very efficient spy system, she had a paid agent in almost every important household or institution. He had to adopt another method. He made a decree that if anyone was found guilty of plotting against the state or blaspheming the god Augustus, his confiscated estates would be divided among his loyal accusers. Plots against the state were less easy to prove than blasphemies against Augustus. The first case of blasphemy against Augustus was that of Awag, a young shopkeeper, who happened to be standing near Tiberius in the marketplace as a funeral passed. He sprang forward and whispered something in the ear of the corpse. Tiberius was curious to know what it was. The man explained that he was asking the dead man to tell Augustus, when he met him down below, that his legacies to the people of Rome had not yet been paid. Tiberius had the man arrested and executed for speaking of Augustus as if he were a mere ghost, not an immortal god, and said that he was sending him down below to convince him of his mistake. A month or two later, by the way, he did pay the legacies in full. In a case like this, Tiberius had some justification, but later, the most harmless abuses of Augustus's name were enough to put a man on trial for his life. A class of professional informers sprang up who could be counted on to make out a case against any man who was indicated to them as having incurred Tiberius's displeasure. Thus, criminal dossiers based on a record of real delinquency were superfluous. Sejanus was Tiberius's go-between with these scoundrels. In the year before Germanicus's return, Tiberius had put the informers to work on a young man called Libo, who was a great-grandson of Pompey and a cousin of Agrippina's, through their grandmother, Scribonia. This is back to AD 16. Sejanus had warned Tiberius that Libo was dangerous, and had been making disrespectful remarks about him. But Tiberius was careful at this stage not to make disrespect to himself an indictable offense. So he had to invent other charges. Now, Tiberius, to cover his own association with Thrasyllus, had expelled from Rome all astrologers, magicians, fortune-tellers, and interpreters of dreams, and forbidden anyone to consult such of them as secretly stayed on. A few stayed with Tiberius's connivance, on condition that they gave seances only with an imperial agent, concealed in the room. Libo was persuaded by a senator who had turned professional informer to visit one of these decoys and have his fortune told. His questions were noted down by the hidden agent. In themselves, they were not treasonable, only foolish. He wanted to know how rich he would become and whether he would ever be the leading man at Rome, and so on. But a forged document was produced at his trial, which was said to have been discovered by slaves in his bedroom. A list in what appeared to be his handwriting of names of all the members of the imperial family and of the leading senators, with curious Chaldean and Egyptian characters written against each name in the margin. The penalty for consulting a magician was banishment, but the penalty for practicing magic oneself was death. Libo denied authorship of the document, and the evidence of slaves, even under torture, would not be sufficient to condemn him. Slave evidence was accepted only when the accusation was that of incest. There was no freedman evidence because Libo's freedman could not be persuaded to testify against him, nor might a freedman be put to torture to force a confession from him. On Sejanus's advice, however, Tiberius made a new legal ruling that when a man was charged with a capital crime, his slaves could be bought at a fair valuation by the public steward and thus enabled to give evidence under torture. Libo, who had not been able to get a lawyer brave enough to defend him, saw that he was caught and asked for an adjournment of the trial until the next day. When this was granted, he went home and killed himself. The charge against him was nevertheless gone through within the Senate with the same formality as if he had been alive, and he was found guilty on all charges. Tiberius said that it was unfortunate that the foolish young man had killed himself, because he would have interceded for his life. Libo's estate was divided among his accusers, among whom were 4 senators. Such a disgraceful farce could never have been played when Augustus was emperor, but under Tiberius it was played, with variations over and over again. Only one man made a public protest, and that was a certain Calpurnius Piso, who rose in the Senate to say that he was so disgusted with the atmosphere of political intrigue in the city, the corruption of justice, and the disgraceful spectacle of his fellow senators acting as paid informers, that he was leaving Rome for good and retiring to some village in a remote part of Italy. Having said this, he walked out. The speech made a powerful impression on the house. Tiberius sent someone to call Calpurnius back, and when he was once more in his seat, told him that if there were miscarriages of justice, any senator was at liberty to call attention to them at question time. He said, too, that a certain amount of political intrigue was inevitable in the capital city of the greatest empire the world has ever known. Did Calpurnius suggest that the senators would not have come forward with their accusations if they had no hopes of reward? He said that he admired Calpurnius's earnestness and independence and envied his talents, but would it not be better to employ these noble qualities for the improvement of social and political morality at Rome than to bury them in some wretched hamlet of the Apennines, among shepherds and bandits? So Calpurnius had to stay, but soon after he showed his earnestness and independence by summoning old Ergolania to appear in court for non-payment of a large sum of money, which she owed him for some pictures and statuary. Calpurnius's sister had died, and there had been a sale. When Ergolania read the summons, which was for her immediate attendance at the debtor's court, she told her chairman to take her straight to Livia's palace. Calpurnius followed her and was met in the hall by Livia, who told him to be off. Calpurnius courteously but firmly excused himself, saying that Ergolania must obey the summons without fail unless too ill to attend, which clearly she was not. Even Vestal virgins were not exempt from attendance at court when summoned. Even Vestal virgins were not exempt from attendance at court when subpoenaed. Livia said that this behavior was personally insulting to her, and that her son, the emperor, would know how to avenge her. Tiberius was sent for and tried to smooth things over, telling Calpurnius that Ergolania surely meant to come as soon as she had composed herself after the sudden shock of the summons, and telling Livia that it was no doubt a mistake, that Calpurnius certainly meant no disrespect, and that he himself would attend the trial and see that Ergolania had a capable counsel and a fair trial. He left the palace, walking beside Calpurnius towards the courts and talking with him of this and that. Calpurnius's friends tried to persuade him to drop the charge, but he replied that he was old-fashioned. He liked being paid money that was owed him. The trial never came off. Livia sent a mounted messenger after them with the whole amount of the debt in gold in his saddlebags. He overtook Calpurnius and Tiberius before they arrived at the door of the court. But I am writing about informers and the demoralization effect they had on life at Rome, and about judicial corruption. I was about to record that while Germanicus was at Rome, there was not a single charge heard in the courts of blaspheming Augustus or of plotting against the state, and the informers were warned to keep absolutely quiet. Tiberius was on his best behavior, and his speeches in the Senate were models of frankness. Sejanus retired into the background. Thrasyllus was removed from Rome to the shelter of Tiberius's village on the island of Capri, and Tiberius appeared to have no intimate friend but the honest Nerva, whose advice he was always asking. Castor I never could learn to like. He was a foul-mouthed, bloody-minded, violent-tempered, dissolute fellow. His character showed up most clearly at a sword fight, where he took more delight in seeing blood spurting from a wound than in any act of skill or courage on the part of the combatants. But I must say that he behaved very finely towards Germanicus, and seemed to understand... But I must say that he behaved very finely towards Germanicus, and seemed to undergo a real change of heart in his company. City factions tried to force the two into the wretched position of rivals for succession to the monarchy, but they never on any occasion encouraged this view. Castor treated Germanicus with the same brotherly consideration that Germanicus gave him. Castor was not exactly a coward, but he was a politician rather than a soldier. When he was sent across the Danube in answer to an appeal for help by the tribes of East Germany, who were fighting a defensive and bloody war against Hermann's Western Confederacy, he managed by clever intrigue to bring into the war the tribes of Bohemia, and of Bavaria too. He was carrying out Tiberius's policy of encouraging the Germans to exterminate each other. Maroboduus, he who walks on the lake bottom, the priest-king of the East Germans, fled for protection to Castor's camp. Maroboduus was given a safe retreat in Italy, and since the East Germans had sworn an oath of perpetual allegiance, he remained for 18 years a hostage for their good behavior. These East Germans were a fiercer and more powerful race than the West Germans, and Germanicus was lucky not to have them at war with him too. But Hermann had become a national hero by his defeat of Varus, and Maroboduus was jealous of his success. Rather than that, Hermann should become High King of all the German nations, which was his ambition. Maroboduus had refused to give him any help in his campaign against Germanicus, even by making a diversion on another frontier. I have often thought about Hermann. He was a remarkable man in his way, and though it is difficult to forget his treachery to Varus, Varus had done much to provoke the revolt, and Hermann and his men were certainly fighting for liberty. They had a genuine contempt for the Romans. They could not understand in what sense the extremely severe discipline in the Roman army under Varus Tiberius and almost every other general But my father and my brother deferred from downright slavery. They were shocked at the disciplinary floggings and regarded the system of paying soldiers at so much a day instead of engaging them by promises of glory and plunder as most base. The Germans have always been very chaste in their morals, and Roman officers openly practiced vices, which in Germany, if they ever came to light, but this was seldom, were punished by smothering both culprits in mud under a hurdle. As for German cowardice, all barbarous people are cowards. If Germans ever became civilized, it will then be time to judge whether they are cowards or not. They seem, however, to be an exceptionally nervous and quarrelsome people, and I cannot make up my mind whether there is any immediate chance of their becoming really civilized. Germanicus thought that there was none. Whether his policy of extermination was justified or not, certainly it was not the usual Roman policy with frontier tribes, depends on the answer to the first question. Of course, the captured eagles had to be won back, and Hermann had shown no mercy after the defeat of Varus, when he overran the province, and Germanicus, who was a most gentle and humane man, disliked general massacre so much that he must have had very good reasons for ordering it. Hermann did not die in battle. When Maroboduus was forced to fly from the country, Hermann thought that his way was now clear to a monarchy over all the nations of Germany. But he was mistaken. He was not even able to make himself monarch of his own tribe, which was a free tribe, the chieftain having no power to command, only to lead and advise and persuade. One day, a year or two later, he tried to issue orders like a king. His family, which had hitherto been greatly devoted to him, were so scandalized that, without even first discussing the matter together, they all rushed at him with their weapons and hacked him to pieces. He was 37 when he died, having been born the year before my brother Germanicus, his greatest enemy.